You at least know what Takata is, but some of you may not know what TDS is. So perhaps before we get the debate going, perhaps we just let Pascal explain very briefly what TDS is. Leave some time for us to discuss the thing, Pascal.
Don't know about TDS, raise your hand. Well, you know. Everybody knows what is TDS. Good. Okay, so that's it. Your turn.
So we have heard Takata. We have all apparently know about TDS. So if you were thinking or talking to someone who'd said to you, which one do you think I should use, okay, in a particular application, what would be the case that you would make for TDS? So I'm thinking of doing some time-dependent information. So give you a first shot, Pascal. What is so unique about TDS that you would think that people would want to do that?
I mean, the specific point of TDS is to not asking scores. And we have not been very good in sailing the method because from the first 7 years, we were asking scores with dominance. And I believed that was a mistake, roughly a mistake, except for some trained panel, because I know people who train panelists to do both at the same time. But at that point, it requires a strong training. But the key point is that if you no longer focus on giving a score, then you can do it with the consumers. And the idea is I taste something, and while I'm tasting the thing, what do I think for? What popped to my mind among a list of attributes? Which one is dominant? And you know, dominant does not mean the most intense, because we want to disconnect to the intensity. It just may be a new flavor arriving. Suddenly, I perceive some flavor, whereas my product was bitter mostly all the time, but I pick this flavor, and then I have to click on this flavor. And that's natural. When you see how people eat, describe food, and the wine tasters also, they do that way. They say, oh, I picked that, and then I picked that, but we also have that. And they speak like that. It's a natural way of describing your perception, I think. And an easy way, an easy way.
And John, so what would you say to someone, they're coming in and they say, we're thinking of using either TDS or Takata, what would your case be?
But maybe you should check that everybody knows Takata.
I've heard it this morning.
No, because maybe not all of them were there this morning, or maybe they don't understand, I don't know.
Well, they should have been here.
Yeah, I think, raise your hand maybe if you don't know Takata, I don't know. Okay, so naturally as a first option, I'd propose Takata. It's not necessarily that I'm against TDS, although at one time I was. And I'll give you some history on that. So when I first saw presentations related to TDS, say 12 years ago, my situation was that I had been trained as a Scotch whiskey taster after a panel, and I looked at the TDS task, and the idea was that my task was supposed to be to have these attributes pop into my head, almost using sort of the type 1 type thinking, very naturally, very spontaneously, and indicate what I'm noticing. But then I had to switch mindsets and give a more analytical score, and so I'm being fluctuated between the two. And I think there's this issue of attention with that type of TDS, and what are we really capturing? And I think there's also another issue, which is that if we're focusing on that type of attention that's supposed to be spontaneous, and what I'm doing is I'm scanning a list of attributes, and attributes are being suggested to me, it's kind of like try not to think of a pink elephant, right? So I see the attribute. There might be another reason that's drawing my attention to it. I might be seeing it, and so I think, oh, that attribute, yes, that's the one, or something like that. There might be other factors. Takata is not making assumptions about attention and where it's coming from. It's asking the person to play the task of, I want to describe this product in the moment. So I thought that it was a very different type of thinking, and I thought that TDS and Takata would give you very different data. Now, I should say that I think that it was very innovative of TDS to move in the direction away from intensity. No one had really, well, that's a lie. Other people had done that in the past in methods that were kind of forgotten. I think in moving away from intensity, it allowed us to focus on something else. And I think that we're still learning about what is the meaning of dominance, and also what is the meaning of this idea of characterizing samples using temporal kata. And I think that in comparing the two methods, in collecting data using both methods, we're actually going to learn more about what each of the methods is capturing. So in the data that I've seen, because I've seen quite a lot of data collected in Canada, in Norway, in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, New Zealand, as well as the United States. I've seen data that's collected using both methods. And, well, based on that data, I would say that people are getting more information, potentially, out of Takata than they are out of TDS. More actionable information, a stronger signal. I do think in some cases they might be getting different information, and perhaps even complementary information. But in some cases, the information's quite redundant. The information that you get in some cases is pretty much the same. So I would encourage people who are considering, you know, which one do I use, to try it. Try both methods. I mean, don't listen to me. Try it with your own products.
One question I would ask is, of that person was, are you going to use a panel, or are you going to use naive consumers? And I might give a different answer depending whether, because it seems to me, I may be wrong, seems to me that the way TDS has gone from being a panelist-based trial, it's gone more towards consumers, and I'm not sure Takata is still asking people to think about, as you said, as a trained whiskey person, it's still really asking people to think about 6 or 7 things and whether they're present or not, whereas TDS is actually a simpler task. So would you accept it's more suitable for consumers, TDS?
I think the jury's out.
Okay.
I'm not convinced that it's a simpler task. As I mentioned this morning, I think that an ordinary consumer might have a very difficult time. You know, if you think of the act of tasting ice cream, you put you get close to your vanilla ice cream, you put it on your tongue, you immediately get cold, sweet, vanilla aroma being released. You get all these things. If I'm a TDS panelist, which one is it? If I were a TDS panelist, my strategy would be sweet vanilla, cold, sweet vanilla,
That's no
cold.
problem. That's no problem.
And some consumers will do that.
Yeah, but it's not a problem because it's how we teach people. If you really think these two are dominant at the same time, just click on A, B until you change your mind. Because then in the data analysis, you share more or less the score to both attributes. By score, I mean the duration of dominance. So that's not the main problem with TDS. There is some problem with TDS, but that's not that one. I can tell you some of the research we've done recently, and I'm going to present at Sansasia, and I hope to write down that stuff very quickly. It's the fact when you mix sensory modalities, when you have texture and the flavor in a cheese, for instance, most of the consumer pick the texture attributes. Even though the products we give them are different flavor. I've been working with a Comté cheese, and now I'm going to do the same with Gruyère from Switzerland and Comté cheese very soon with Barbara, who is in the conference at the top. And the fact is, it's easier to say it's crunchy, although Comté is not crunchy, but you know, the texture is easier. So at the end of the day, we got quite weak description of the flavor of these very flavored cheese. And so now we're doing the dual TDS, which is we have two lists of attributes, one list of texture attributes on the left side of the screen, and one list of flavor attributes on the right part of the screens. And you can have two attributes dominant at the same time, but one in the texture list and one in the texture attribute. So you can click crunchy, then you click cocoa for chocolate. Crunchy is still highlighted. Now I think it's melting, so I click on melting and crunchy is off, but I still have cocoa, okay? So we have implemented that. It works pretty well because we compare the traditional technique, that one, on several type of products. So in a way, we've done a step towards Takata. It's only two attributes and very different and for specific purpose. And the same thing for wine description, the gustative attributes easier than the flavor. And people pick sweet, acidity, more often, alcohol. And so we do the same thing for gustative and olfactives.
Okay, so out to the class, if you like, to comment, Nicholas.
Could I respond to that as well, though? Okay, Nicholas can go first. Nikolai can go first.
Nicholas, then you.
Okay, thanks. So John, you know I'm biased toward TDS, of course, but for me, one of the key difference between the two is that TDS is pick the one, and your method is pick the ones. Mm-hmm. So for me, this is one thing that makes, to my view, that it's a bit more complicated, but what's behind is that then you have to unclick and to say it's stopped. So I'm quite really in line with what Had was saying in terms of, for me, TDS is more to consumer and the general way of doing the things, and it's just that I think about something and I just say what I'm thinking about, which is for me less analytical than having a list of things and the items to click. And I think at the beginning when we were in TDS, yes, we did with intensity because we were used to intensity. Get rid of that, fine. But then what we, maybe by chance made that, is that we changed the rule. We are not scoring something, we are choosing among a list. And it's just one choice. And I guess this is much closer from consumer way of doing, is just to choose something and say, this is what is important for me. And we don't want to have the base signal like a coffee is bitter. Okay, thanks. But I'm not interested by this noise signal. I want to know what makes the difference between my samples. And I guess in this way, we go more into something which is closer to the behavior of the people and we capture better the behavior of them. And when Pascal, you're saying that now you go toward Takata, saying we can separate texture and flavor, personally, I would still stay on the same thing to have the info about, but then what matters between texture and flavor? And I think I would still want to know whether texture is more important than flavor and still want to have just one signal and not two.
But, Nicolas, with this data, you can analyze either separately, because, okay, yes. you have, in fact, you have 3 TDS in one shoot.
Yes, but
because you can analyze them, the texture alone, the flavor alone, or both of them.
But what's the instruction to the panelists?
But we explained what I told you just before. We explained the notion of dominance. We say it's possible to have one dominance in each category. We have also allowed for the no dominance periods. That is, if you re-click on the crunchy button, which was highlighted, it's off, and you no longer have any texture dominant, because I think that's interesting too. So it's not very more complicated to understand as the instructions. To do it, of course, it is more difficult because you have 2 things.
John.
Okay, so to keep track of some of the things that came up.
Don't publish that before me, please, because I have people who need that.
So regarding the different modalities, I think that personally, I think it's of interest to understand the different modalities simultaneously. I think that the idea of texture first followed by flavor has a lot to do with your product category, in the sense that as you break down the food matrix, you know, cheese or something, as you break that down, the volatiles get released, and then you get the flavors. So, but whereas something else, where let's say that you had salted tortilla chips, you might get that salt right away on your tongue, right? And then there's a breakdown, and then you get other flavors. So it really, I think, depends very much on the product category. But in regards to consumers and Takata and what comes natural, I agree. And actually, what I had expected. So last year, Pascal and Arnaud Thomas had donated a data set to Sensometrics for a data analysis workshop, and I was one of the people who analyzed the data. What I was expecting to find for the consumer data was exactly that pattern, where consumers would click one attribute, then another, and go back to the first, and back and forth, and back and forth. But they don't do that, and I think that some people will use that strategy, and other people will say, well, it's good enough that I just clicked it once, even regardless of instruction. There was one other point that I wanted to make.
It'll come to you.
And it'll come to me. Yeah, please carry on.
Anybody else want to comment? Hello.
I have one question for Mr. Schlich.
Pascal.
It's during your TDS, did you ask the panelists to taste specifically the product, like for the first 30 seconds you have to chew and then swallow after 40 seconds? Did you ask this kind of task, or it was just taste the product and then choose between texture, flavor, or both?
That's an excellent question. When we started with TDS, we tried to standardize everything because we were in the train panel thinking modes. And so as I asked, that's why I asked the question this morning about do people could swallow or spit the wine at a precise time. We did that. You have to do, you put the wine into the mouth and you did 3 times, not 4, not 2, 3 times. We call that grumer in Burgundy, grumer le vin. And then they had to swallow at 20 seconds, I think. And because we were not sure about that task, so we wanted to standardize everything as a scientist and see if we can discriminate our product. But now that we are using that with consumer, and we should not ask that. They will never follow this rule, of course. And we want to do that remotely at home, in canteens, or we need to go out of the sensory lab. So we cannot put all these stress onto the consumer, I think. So this is why we need to have the simpler technique as possible for them to do.
And yes, sorry.
I have a question for John. Nicolas raised the question of unchecking, which may seem unnatural.
Yes.
Why not do kata every 5 seconds, so people don't have to uncheck, but they have a new questionnaire popping up every 5 seconds?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that back up. That is the point that I wanted to follow up on. We've gone for a different angle on that. The angle that we've taken is to basically have it so that you select an attribute, and it's kind of, the button turns gold, and then it kind of fades back gradually to an unselected state. So the assessor can kind of see their selection going away, and they can reselect it if they think that it still applies, and so they can carry on. That is nice because it means that when an attribute is checked, imagine that there's some threshold that has to cross in order for them to check it. Maybe the attribute to be unchecked has to cross a different threshold. And so, what does it mean? But then, on the other hand, there's another bias that comes into play in the fading approach that we're using. So you click the attribute, it begins to fade, and then you might get kind of lazy, right? You might kind of say, I've clicked that button enough. I've given my. So there's 2 biases going on. It could be that the fading makes it stop too early. It could be that it makes it stop too late. But it could be that unchecking, probably makes it stop too late. The truth might be somewhere in between, but there's probably no perfect answer. And the rechecking all the time might have the same problem. This idea that, I've given them enough information, that's enough, Thanks.
But Cécile, Your question is interesting because for some product like chewing gum, for instance, you have to evaluate it during 15 minutes, say, or 10. So I don't believe in a 10 minutes TDS because it's too boring. Too boring to stay 10 minutes in front of that clicking. It's just too long for the consumer. So we may pop up some screen every minute, for instance, or 2 minutes, I don't know. And then comes the question, am I going to ask a score? Then it's what was called a repeated QDA, or I don't know.
Progressive profiling.
Yeah, temporal profiling. But you can also pop up TDS screens for 10 seconds, so people, or Kata screen or whatever, and evaluate that along the full time of the perception of the experience of the products. That's very important, I think. And so for cosmetics, that the time range can be the full day.
Okay, Damien, I think you've got a question.
Do you study the impact of the number of attributes on the performance of the test? And what is your recommendation about the number of attributes consumer can use?
There is an excellent paper by Pinot, Saint-Ève, and I don't know.
2 years ago?
Yeah, we tried to, we looked at that on a couple of studies we have in TDS. We did 20 papers, and it just seems that too long, it's too big for the guys, but I think it depends on who you are asking to as well. For me, in this debate, there is also, do we consider TDS or Takata as a sensory method for descriptive measure, and maybe these panels might be a bit better and can have a bit shorter, longer list? Or do we consider this is more a consumer method, and in this case, the terms have to be crystal clear and maybe to have not too much of them? What we found is that, let's say a list around 10 or less than 10 is manageable. Above 10, 12, it starts to be quite long for guys to get it. But if you say tomorrow you go for a test for 15 terms because you have a good reason for that, then why not? Huh?
I could add one point,
Yeah.
which is, Nicolas, the meta-analysis that you ran in order to come to the conclusion that a good attribute list would be 10 or fewer terms. Initially with Takata, we used that approach as well. We kind of said, well, it kind of makes sense, they've done some work, we'll go with 10. After doing some thinking about it, what I've come to realize is that the meta-analysis that was done was based on the idea of the crossing the significance threshold in TDS, and whether the attributes crossed. In Takata, we don't really have that same significance line, and we have a different type of analysis that we've run, and for that reason, for Takata, I think the jury's out, and even I think it might be even a question worth revisiting with time. And you're right, it could be different for consumers.
Yeah, it was not exactly about the significance. It was just for some of the attributes to know whether at least they were picked once out of the full list of products. And with long list, we can see that if you have 18 attributes, some of them are never ever picked for any product description. So it means that maybe it's a bit too much for the guys to handle it. But yes, definitely.
Well, that's one point I was thinking, is that let me represent the behavioral psychologists again. And they would say, you know, when they do word association, they don't ask you for a long list of things that are in your mind. They ask you for 3 things that are in your mind. And I wondered whether there is a case that we're being too prescriptive again, and that we should do free choice TDS. And we just ask people, what is in your mind? What is in your mind? What are the 3 things that might be in your mind? Do 200 consumers and just see which words come out, and whether that would be the same result that you might get from your very detailed prescriptive.
Yeah,
but let me write that first, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it is lunchtime.